welcome to Green Foundation and SID Washington. My name is Sally Whaley. I'm the program coordinator here at SID. I just want to give a couple remarks about our organization, introduce Alex, and then pass it over to get started. For those of you who aren't familiar with SID, we're the membership organization in the DC area for international development. We have a few events coming up in the near future. Most importantly, our annual conference is on June 5th, which I encourage you all to check out. I'm sure you all have flyers in your hand about it. And another thing I'd like to mention is our development finance work group, which you might all be interested in, which is related to the topic. We have several topical and regional work groups that we operate here at SID, and all of this can be found on our website. We have a great panel for you guys today. I'd like to introduce Alex Counts, who has graciously agreed to moderate our panel this morning. Alex is the founder and CEO of Green Foundation, which he founded in 1997 and has grown to be a very impressive organization in the international humanitarian field. You all have full bios in front of you, so I won't expound upon anything too much, but get us started. So thanks for being here.
All right. Well, thank you and welcome to all of you, especially if it's your first time visiting Green Foundation's office, which we now are co-located with SID Washington. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm really quite honored to be part of this and to be asked to moderate. In terms of Green Foundation, I would simply say that we went through one of these long processes about 4 years ago to revise our mission statement. And I was, whenever people go through that process, there are people that kind of greet it with some eye rolling and how can we get this over with quickly. And I was one of those in Green Foundation. But we ended up, after looking at many options, with something that was really concise and everyone rallied behind. And it was that we're working to enable the poor, and especially the poorest, to create a world without poverty. And interestingly, for some people, that microfinance isn't mentioned. Many things that are important to what we do today aren't mentioned, but that was at its core. And so we see that what we were about fundamentally, and what I think we'll be about in 25 years, even if we're doing very different things, is how do you enable the world's poor to become actors, agents in the elimination of poverty. And we feel there are many tools that enable that. We've tried to be good at two of those tools, which is financial services as a way, self-empowerment tool, and information services. And so, especially in the areas of information about health and agricultural best practices and jobs and commerce. And what we find especially exciting is how that when people actually have access to finance and also actionable, relevant information, that some pretty interesting things start to happen. And that encompasses our two major programmatic areas. If you want to learn more, obviously you can visit our website, talk to me or any of our staff. But now to the matter at hand. I should say that microfinance has hit some rocky waters in the last 2 years. I hope that's not news to any of you, if you've been reading even the mainstream newspapers. And if I had to say one learning from that, I have probably about 8 or 10, is that in microfinance we've neglected kind of collective action, collective analysis, field-wide, and collective advocacy, collective, trying to think of not just what our organization is up against, but what our field is up against. And it's really had me invest more in types of groups like the Society for International Development. I see the value of it more than I ever saw before, and though the ones I've been most involved in are specifically involved in kind of collective analysis and education and problem solving within the microfinance field. But to put this conversation in a little bit of context, I'm writing a book on the leading microfinance organization of Haiti, Foncosé, but I'm kind of broadening it, and it's a work in progress. But the broadening message has an aspect of it is something like this, which I think is relevant to our discussion. It wasn't so long ago that when you thought about kind of whether it's the economy, whether it's trying to bring up sections of the national or international economy that were left behind, you basically thought of a couple of actors. You thought of business, who was around to create wealth and employment. You thought about government was a very important actor. Government was there to work alongside business, sometimes have its own businesses competing with the private sector, regulate business, and then try to kind of clean up the mess that business left behind, or the problems that business didn't solve in terms of creating wealth and employment for people and well-being generally. And then there were the civil society, which had a very small role. As far as I can tell, I'm going to be reading more about this because I'm trying to get more of a historical perspective. It was to kind of be an outsourced, be an outsourced partner for government in the cleaning up mess category. Secondly, it was about using private money to kind of clean up messes that still remain, and maybe to pilot things, social innovations that then either government or business could pick up. But it was never really thought that civil society could actually scale on a national level solutions itself. I think that's a fairly recent phenomenon, but an important one. And it raises the question of, if you're going to do that, who's going to finance it? Right? Where's the money going to come from? If it's not a handoff scenario, if we showed in 5 villages this can work, business, government take it from here, which have adequate sources of financing in many cases. We want to do it, well then who's going to pay for it? Who's going to finance it? And that's really brings us to, I think, the topic we have here. Microfinance was, I think, one of the early examples of a social innovation that scaled on its own terms, really never giving it away from civil society, but keeping it embedded in civil society. And it is interesting because it is both an example of a scaled social innovation, and that financing capability brought down to the grassroots level, I think, can be an enabler or accelerator for other social innovations. And I would just draw the attention, if you haven't seen it, to a book that came out through another collective kind of action process around microfinance called the Microcredit Summit Campaign. And every 5 years they have a global meeting, and they come out with a book, the last 3. And this is called New Pathways Out of Poverty, and it's really a terrific book of I think about 7 articles. I co-authored one of them, about microfinance, what's right with it, what's wrong with it, where's the cutting edge. And my paper that I co-authored was about how microfinance can be an enabler for clean energy solutions. And by the way, this can be bought in the English version from Kumarian Press or the Microcredit Summit Campaign for reasons I won't bore you with. The French and Spanish versions, the online versions, are actually free. And so if you read French or Spanish well, you don't have to pay for it, but if you can't, then you got to pay for it. So, in terms of in terms of the financing and other things to scale civil society-led social innovation needs a whole ecosystem, not just financing, though that's an important part. And so we have different players in, I think, that evolving ecosystem here to share their respective experiences. In terms of Green Foundation ensuring the finance of especially microfinance, I think our 2 big things that I mentioned in passing are we developed a loan guarantee program to incent local banks in the countries we operate to basically get involved in providing at least debt to, if not other things like equity, in microfinance organizations, for-profit and non-profit. Because we felt that most of the financing as of 10 years ago in microfinance was still kind of grants and what you might call philanthropy, or foreign debt and equity, which carried a number of risks. And we felt getting the local financial sector involved was important. We would share the risk, and 5-7 years later, we, with a fund that's varied and backed by some of our board members and high net worth backers, we facilitated about $200 million of local currency debt, not a single default, and have really opened up banking relationships for some leading MFIs that has had a bit of a cascading effect, that we feel that the percentage of local currency lending to MFIs has gone significantly up in the past, more than doubled, I think, in the past just 5 years alone. The other thing is we believe that savings is a very important source of financing for scaling up microfinance, and we've been part of a 7 kind of network Gates Foundation project to promote microsavings. We've been focused on Ethiopia, Philippines, and India, And around that time, it's not actually funded by that project, but we came out with years in the making. I won't share you the horror stories, but we finally came out with something called the Grameen Guidelines, which is a manual about how Grameen operates, and people that have adapted Grameen, and the savings things under Grameen 2 is a major focus, and we've never really had it in one place before last year. And this is in English. You can freely download it from our website today, and it's a resource we probably haven't publicized as much as we should have. But anyway, it is out there, and it's a great kind of how-to on this, especially again around how do you mobilize savings to be the engine of growth of social innovation and microfinance. So our panelists, let me introduce all three of them and then just turn it over. So Premal Shah will speak first from Kiva, the co-founder of Kiva. You know, when I graduated from Cornell, I used to say that Stanford was a good West Coast school. But I've between him coming out of the Stanford experience, creating Kiva, meeting my wife on the Stanford campus, and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law going to Stanford, I've had to kind of rein myself in and be a bit more respectful. But Kiva is one of the great innovations in the microfinance space, connecting civil society through a peer-to-peer lending platform, and has had great media attention. And one of the things that most struck me when Matt Flannery was presenting a few years ago when I was there is that I think roughly half of the people that put on the Kiva platform, it's the first time they've ever been involved in any type of international humanitarian work, volunteer or financing. And that's hundreds and hundreds of people every week, maybe every day. And these are all new people. And that's exciting. It's not the reaching to the converted, they're reaching a whole new audience. So that's a very exciting. And again, you really need not say more about this, what he's done. Lots of recognition from the World Economic Forum, et cetera, et cetera. Terry Wire, Senior Associate from Center for Strategic International Studies, is now posted with Shore Bank International, focused on right now South Africa and connecting social innovation and impact investing type of things there, and was previously with the IFC. And then lastly, Charles Alsdorf from Deloitte, who will be kind of introducing himself as part of his presentation, but is now leads Deloitte's financial advisory services practice and capital efficiency, and also is a leader in Deloitte's enterprise sustainability program, which is, I think, probably will inform a lot of what he has to say. Formerly before that with Standard & Poor's. And again, so we have three different players that again are important, represent important aspects of this ecosystem around financing social innovation. That is, again, I'm saying a relatively recent phenomenon, I think a very exciting one. So without further ado, I'll give it over to Premal.
Hi everyone, and thanks Alice for the introduction. I'm such a huge fan of both the Grameen Foundation and your work over the years. You guys have been absolute leaders, and we can sit there in San Francisco and read the websites and try to really study, what are the best practices and how can we actually be really helpful within this ecosystem. Kiva is a relatively new website, or new organization. We're 6 years old, and what we started on as is really, just trying to create a way. Matt and Jessica, the two co-founders of Kiva, we're just trying to create a real simple way for their friends and family to participate in microfinance. And it didn't have a real kind of deep theory of change. In many ways, we're kind of backing into, wow, how can we actually be most helpful given the resource engine that's been created. And so let me tell you a little bit about the website. I guess what I like to do is, okay, great, well, this is one part of the website right here. But let me pull back. If you come to the website, people have described it as kind of microfinance meets Match.com. And we believe that when you can create, when you can see someone and participate in their stories and read about their stories, it creates an empathy, and that empathy creates a generosity. And with that generosity, we believe that there's this opportunity to create this kind of add to this middle space of capital between donations and commercial investment. I think other folks have really pioneered this, like Acumen Fund and what they talk about with their patient capital thesis. This is something that we're really interested in, which is what Kiva does is we raise 0% interest debt capital from the internet community. And when you pick that loan, that person, say Tarek in Lebanon, if Tarek defaults, then you absorb the default of Tarek. And so what that means is that our field partners around the planet, we work with about 150 field partners. They're mainly microfinance institutions. What we would like to do is be an R&D budget for them to kind of push out their own risk and cost frontier. So for example, we had a picture up there of a student, and for many microfinance institutions, student lending is not something that they've attempted to do. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem because not many people are doing it. There's no real clear repayment track record. There's no kind of clear way to actually underwrite these loans and do it in a commercially viable way. That's a really great use case of all of our risk capital to come in and say, hey, look, in addition to the 0% interest capital, the internet community will take the loss if these students don't repay. And then the theory of change there is that if we can prove, say, a high 90s repayment rate, then they can mainstream that part of the portfolio. So one of the things that we think about is how can we actually be on kind of the risk and cost frontiers and kind of push out the edges of not only microfinance but of just financial services. And you think about kind of being catalytic in three ways. The first is serving populations that are underserved. The second is kind of looking at new product areas. Alex mentioned clean energy. I just mentioned higher education. We think that there's a number of kind of new areas, and I think Acumen Fund's done incredible work in this respect. And then the third is actually looking at the price of financial services. So just to get into new populations, I was just in the Republic of Georgia last year. And if you go to Tbilisi, Georgia, in that market, you'll see actually multiple microfinance institutions competing for the same clients. And what's interesting is that the way that they actually underwrite the loans is they do cash flow analysis. So they look at the household revenues, kind of based on how many assets does this household have, and kind of a rough sense of revenue per month. Then they look at the household costs. They kind of say, okay, how many dependents, how many children, how many kind of elderly. They try to get a sense of that, and then revenues minus costs is the monthly income. And then they figure out whether or not they can actually make a loan, and they look at the principal and interest payments of that loan on a monthly basis. And they want the monthly income to cover almost twice of what the principal plus interest payments are. And if you don't cover twice, then they decline you, and that's their underwriting standards. And most MFIs in the market are roughly around that level. So if you're a pensioner, and you basically have very little income, but for example, if you could get a loan from a Finca or a Credo, there's kind of multiple organizations. If you could actually get a loan to maybe buy some apricot trees or a few cows, chances are that you could actually get that kind of income level that could get you above the threshold to actually then tap into all the other microfinance institutions. However, the MFI that we're working with and the other MFIs we talked to, they were reluctant to lend below a certain threshold because it was speculative and they were worried about portfolio quality. That's a great use case of the Kiva Capital, which is they can now R&D with a population that they currently decline up on the Kiva website. And if those folks don't pay, then all of us kind of eat the loss, and it's kind of a risk distribution. But if they do pay, the hope is then there's a way to price it and graduate into the mainstream. So that's an idea around populations. We also look at, for example, right now, I think Kiva funds, as an outside funder, more MFIs in post-conflict Africa than any other funder on the planet. And oftentimes what happens is that the country risk is seen as too high, and so we'd like to come in, be the first in capital, and then ideally attract other capital sources there. So that's a little around the new populations. In terms of products, we think about kind of higher ed. So this student right here, this is not posted by a microfinance institution, this is posted by a university in Kenya called Strathmore University. And so now, Strathmore can actually, for students who otherwise might not have been able to go and complete education, this is someone who got nearly an $8,000 loan. The loan term is 39 months, which is much longer than kind of the average microfinance loan term. There's probably a grace period on this that's actually quite long, and it's risky. But the whole idea is that if this person can not only graduate, kind of see higher income, but then also pay back, then this could be something that's mainstreamed. And so what's really interesting is because Strathmore University already has the relationship with the student, they already have the ability, I think, to underwrite the loan at a lower cost than the microfinance institutions in the area. So in addition to working with MFIs in the market, we now want to start working with basically orgs like Strathmore University, or in the clean energy space, we're working with Barefoot Power to make kind of lighting kits, solar lighting kits, to do distributor financing. We're talking to folks like Kickstart International that make pumps, irrigation pumps where there's kind of a cost recovery for that farmer. How can we start working with innovations in the field that are proven and actually help them set up a credit program to reach, to basically make whatever proven service that they have more affordable, more accessible. So that's another part of our strategy. And then the final thing that we're doing at Kiva is we're experimenting with a truly direct model. So Kiva for the first 6 years is really characterized by an intermediate model where there's an organization on the ground where we send the money to that organization and we're backfilling their loans. But I think the promise of the internet is actually where this student right here, Rosemary, could actually speak in her own voice and actually raise money herself. And I think the proof point of that is Kickstarter. So if you look at Kickstarter here in the US, it's about 3 years old, and this year it'll raise about $150 million on the platform. That's more than the National Endowment of the Arts is going to give out this year. And we believe that for small businesses around the world, as internet penetration, as mobile penetration increases, if they knew about the opportunity to raise debt capital, or even capital tied to maybe their percentage of revenues from the internet community directly, that they may value that as a valuable option in addition to formal financial services, friends and families, kind of other sources of capital. And so we have a program called zip.q.org, where in Nairobi, Kenya, via M-Pesa, we're now allowing basically direct loans right to the mobile phone of clients. And the whole idea is if they pay back the loan, they'll be able to access future capital at a much lower rate. We're also doing that in San Francisco. And so, what we believe is, if we can kind of run a lot of R&D with this capital, we'll stumble upon innovations or help support innovations that can really make a difference in people's lives.
Great. I think the lesson for me there is that this isn't your grandmother's Kiva. In terms of the innovation, this has actually helped me catch up with the innovation that Kiva has been doing, and perhaps that is true for some of you, so thank you, Premal. Terry.
Yes. Thank you. First, let me start out by thanking Sid Washington for putting this event together. It's a very important event, and listening to Premal regarding Kiva is very interesting, and seeing different models that work to get financing to the rural population. What I'm going to talk about today is really about public and private sector engagement, and specifically in agriculture. As most of you in the room, and I'm going to stand up for this presentation if you don't mind. As most of you in the room know, there have been significant price increases on commodities over the last couple of years, and so thus you've had several things happen in regards to the public sector and the private sector getting engaged in this agricultural sector. Just to frame the issue in regards to Feed the Future, 1 child dies from hunger every 6 seconds. These are grim numbers, but I just wanted to frame the issue to understand what we're dealing with here in regards to Feed the Future. 70% of the poor in developing economies live in rural areas and depend upon agriculture as a key driver for their income. And food security is linked to global security. So without food, adults struggle, children struggle, and it becomes an issue in regards to conflict. Again, some more numbers here. Population is projected to be at 9 billion by 2050. If we're using today's techniques and approaches to grow food, it will not suffice. The math won't add up for us to be able to feed that population of 9 billion by 2050. So I already mentioned the two sharp prices, spikes in prices on basic commodities in 2008 was really the shocker. Up to 2008, you really had the multinationals and the donors in general not paying much attention to agriculture. In fact, over the 20 years previous to 2008, development money going to the sector had dwindled down considerably. So 2008 was a shock with the first spike in commodity prices. This prompted the meeting that, in point number 3 there, the meeting in Italy with the global community. So you had governments and you had multinationals getting together in Italy and coming up with the Rome Principles. The Rome Principles laid out 5 different principles, but as you can see, 25 billion from donors was committed at that meeting for Feed the Future. Coming out of that, the U.S. government committed 3.5 billion out of that 25 to Feed the Future initiatives. And in 2010, May 2010, USAID announced the 3.5 billion 3-year presidential initiative called Feed the Future. I would imagine that most of you in the room know what Feed the Future is, so I won't go into detail about it. But basically, in point 4 there, it's to invest in country-owned plans based on individual strategies, aligning the resources. So that's the key to my presentation today, aligning resources of not only non-governmental partners, but also looking at the private sector and how we can leverage those. The other point that I would make is the multilateral investment. So even though the U.S. government is putting $3.5 billion into Feed the Future, how can that be better used and leveraged together with the World Bank, for example, and other development banks that are actually out there doing this work also, because that doesn't happen as much as it should. Important questions to still be answered. Again, the missing piece is the private sector here. I did a presentation yesterday where we talked about this topic as well, and one of the panelists was a senior member from EcoBank, one of the largest banks in Africa. It covers 33 countries across Africa, and it has 17 billion of assets. So that $17 billion is huge compared to the other panelists that were represented, which was MCC, USAID, and OPIC. So it just paled in comparison how much development money is going, but if you just could leverage the private sector, and that's one bank in Africa with $17 billion that we could leverage. And if we start utilizing the private sector, who needs to get into this sector, who wants to be in this sector? I mean, I'll give you another example where John Deere, as Alex mentioned, I'm based in South Africa now, and I'm dealing with John Deere down there, who was trying to actually move across sub-Saharan Africa and build out a platform of tractors that they can sell to smallholder farmers. So it's a relatively cheap tractor and utensils that go along with the tractor. I think it's around $30,000. Very expensive for a smallholder in Africa, but if that smallholder can buy and then utilize that to help 100 farmers in the community to also plow their fields, that's the idea. But what we're having an issue with is John Deere is not able to get into some of these countries that they would like to get into because financing is the major issue. So that's where, again, the banks need to come to play, and they're not doing that. And again, if we can bring in a development money, whether that be OPIC money or MCC money, or even an AID DCA guarantee, for example, which is what I'm going to give an example here towards the end of my presentation on what we're doing with DCA guarantee to leverage some private sector money. But going back to the questions here, so what we've got is how do we better serve farmers, the smallholders in particular. We talk about access to finance, which is a major issue, and I'll give you an example, as I said, towards the end. But the other thing that we need to talk about is getting farmers inputs and getting them all of the things that they need, the seed, the fertilizer, so on and so forth. That's financing, but it's also about how do you teach farmers and how do you bring the technical support that's needed for farmers to be able to grow from, let's say, 10 units a hectare to 100 units a hectare. And it's been one of the things about Africa is that the production per hectare is dramatically lower than the rest of the world. So there's really room for growth there, and that's what we need to help. So it's technical support at the farm level, but it's also really technical support at the financial institution level, and I think that's where we need to focus as well. So, and my main role in Africa is working on a USAID project there, working with financial institutions, so we build out capacity. But it's easier said than done, as many of you who have been in the field know, that making change at a financial institution, even though it, for example, we throw a guarantee on the side of it and we give them new products, technical support, it's still difficult because of the risk aversion that the banks have in these economies, and specifically in South Africa. The one good thing I would say about the South African banks, and there's 4 of them that dominate the market, they collaborate very, very closely on pricing and things of this nature, but the one thing I would say is during the 2008 financial crisis, they survived, and they did very well during that because of their risk aversion. But now we've kind of switched over, and we need to start to open up the channel for small SMEs and small rural farmers. So this is what we're talking about. And as I move to the example from South Africa, one of the things that we're trying to do by utilizing the DCA guarantee from USAID, we are working with a couple asset management firms. One thing that did happen recently in South Africa is the law changed so that pension funds, insurance companies, and many of the major investors now are able to take 25% of their investment and invest it in unlisted assets. Previously, it was something around 2 to 3% that they were able to do. So there's a huge window that's opened up just recently this year, where these pension funds and these insurance companies are able to now invest into unlisted companies. That means SMEs. And so what we've done is we've worked with these asset management firms to build out a platform. I'll go to the last slide because it'll give you a picture of what I'm talking about. So here, what we're doing is we're utilizing the U.S. Development Credit Authority guarantee, and we're working with asset management firms here where we're going to bring in a guarantee of 50% pari passu. And they will go out to pension funds, insurance companies, and raise capital based on the guarantee that's there. They will set up a special window within their firm, and they will on-lend to MBFIs, because the asset management firms aren't able to lend directly into SMEs, again, because of the cost ratio, but they're going to go to MBFIs who can have that reach. So I'll give you an example. In South Africa, there is a company called SID-US. Anybody who's been to South Africa knows that there's these little micro buses that run around, and very annoying, but they do get people around. And so SA Taxi is a good example of an MBFI where they on-lend to individuals to buy those taxis to then go and take a route and be able to take people around. So that's where, for example, the MBFI SA Taxi will lend to, let's say, 250 taxi drivers, who then will continue to have a route and a new taxi, so on and so forth. And then there's others that on-lend to SMEs. So this is a good example where the public and the private sector are coming together, where we're able to go out and outreach into pension funds, insurance companies at the top level, which normally wouldn't be in this field, and investing down into the SME market. But because of that USAID guarantee of 50%, they're willing to take that risk. And again, we have that small little window where the law just changed so that they can, so now they are able to lend into these types of things. And I'll just back up for those of you that aren't familiar with the DCA guarantee. Basically, a DCA guarantee works like this. USAID signs an agreement with a partner institution, the financial institution. In most cases, a typical DCA guarantee wouldn't be as difficult as the one that I previously showed you. But a typical USAID guarantee is this, where we go, where we go to a bank, a financial institution, give a guarantee, and then they on-lend to SMEs. So whether that be, in the case of South Africa, ABSA, Standard Bank, across Sub-Saharan Africa, EcoBank, for example, has signed many DCA guarantees across the continent, utilizing the U.S. government Treasury backing to go ahead and lend into particular sectors that they're interested in. And the other thing that, going back to the agriculture and Feed the Future, it is a very big focus of USAID. So we are utilizing the USAID guarantee to push into the agricultural sector. And then there's other sectors such as energy efficiency, socially responsible investment, and just going back to that this slide here, one of the asset management firms that we're working with is actually going to be leveraging $150 million. And so what they're doing is they're actually taking a guarantee of, I think it's 20 million, and leveraging that, so they're only going to have a 20% guarantee on that 20 million, which is going to reach up to 150 million worth of capital that they're going to be able to raise to on-lend to NBFIs. And all of that 150 million will go to socially responsible investments. So it's an interesting concept, new, innovative, and we're also starting to discuss this type of innovation in Kenya, and I believe in Rwanda as well. So going back to the topic of public and private sector initiatives and engagements in innovative financing, and I've given you some examples on Feed the Future, but just in general, I think what's very important as we go forward in creating better access to finance for the poor, for the really poor, is to leverage the private sector and the public sector money that's out there. The public sector money is a small drop in the bucket if we could leverage the private sector, which is wanting to engage in many of these countries and many of these continents. Africa alone, working in Africa, you realize that it is the last frontier. Everybody wants to be there, including the private sector. So if we could help them build platforms to allow the private sector and the public sector to leverage each other, I think we would have much more success in development and development impact across Africa and other places that need it. Thank you.
Excellent. And give a nice round of applause to all three speakers after you hear that. And but thank you so much. Hopefully this can have this. The mood of this session, which is very informative, also be a little less subdued. I should say also that one of our the many strengths of this panel, one of them is not gender diversity. So I hope that some of the women in the audience will speak up to make yourself a big part of this session. By the way, there are a couple empty seats up the front, so maybe after the last presentation or whenever, as it seems appropriate, you can come up and take some of these seats if you don't have a seat. Great turnout today, obviously. So, Charles, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be on a panel with these illustrious organizations, organizations that I've admired for many years. So it's really an honor, and thank you all for being here today. I'm not going to be using slides, but I am going to speak from some notes. So what I wanted to do was to start by giving a little bit of an introduction myself that's not in the bio, and I do that for a reason, because I wanted to be able to stress some points. So bear with me as I talk about me for a moment. But in college, I did a senior thesis on community land trusts as a way of creating property ownership for disadvantaged communities. And we created one in Providence, Rhode Island, in a low-income, multiracial community where we acquired abandoned property and created community gardens and demonstration farm and learning programs for children. And then throughout my 20s, I worked in the nonprofit sector, largely involved with domestic hunger relief and doing fundraising and operations at the local food bank. I then went to business school, and that's started becoming more mainstream, I guess. I did a fellowship in the middle of business school, a year fellowship in Moscow. And that was an interesting period during economic transition, 91 and 92. It was kind of like landing on Mars. It was a fascinating period. And then I really began a career as a financial advisor, what I do now. Although at that time in the 90s, I was doing a lot of work in infrastructure, privatization, project finance, PPP type of work early on. A lot of that was the big to the big. So big institutions providing capital for big infrastructure projects. I point that out because I think, as somebody was saying, peer-to-peer, civil society, the Kiva models, we've really seen a very interesting evolution in the last couple decades. Then I spent a few years at, I then migrated into more of a traditional financial career and built kind of a quantitative modeling practice. Then migrated and spent a few years at Standard & Poor's in their bond rating business, where I had global responsibility for their technology, analytics, and data for the bond rating business. So I joined Deloitte about 6 years ago, and I lead a practice that we call capital efficiency. And a lot of what we focus on is helping organizations, governments, nonprofits, and corporations when they're allocating resources and how to do that effectively. And frankly, in most organizations, it's a food fight. You have a lot of stakeholders, a lot of objectives, a lot of points of view. Information is dispersed all over the place, not unlike microfinance. And so it's a very messy process. One of the things that we bring to bear in that situation are techniques to measure the range of benefits that you filter your decision and your capital through. And a lot of that is not only financial criteria, but strategic and indirect criteria. So even for corporations, it's often the investment decision does involve a lot of intangibles. Often, what's the impact of the community, of the environment? The work that we do in the government, very much this is certainly the same. Looking at social criteria, job creation, economic impacts. We do a lot of work, pro bono work sometimes, in the nonprofit sector, and helping them as they're allocating grants and trying to measure how do I do that most effectively in order to achieve the biggest social and economic impact we can with our scarce resources. And then also a lot in the sustainability space. I do work a lot with our sustainability. We have actually a program right now where we're doing a series of stakeholder engagement workshops to help Deloitte determine what should we be reporting on in terms of sustainability. And it's an area where lots of organizations are reporting. Everybody's reporting different stuff, and there's no standard in terms of what people are reporting or what they determine as materiality. So it's a good development that this information is out there, but it's still early on, the lack of standards. So I mention all of this background for a couple of reasons. One, so you can appreciate my perspective or my biases or lack of knowledge. Two, that I, like many of you, are, this is a room of early adopters and enthusiasts. I don't think anybody here needs to be convinced the importance of microfinance, of socially responsible investing, impact investing. But it's early on, and the question is, how do we make it bigger? And how do we involve more and more mainstream capital in this emerging asset class? And then finally, I mention this background because part of what I look at when I look at this field, in particular around impact investing and benefits measurement, part of what I look at is the technology, the data analytics, and performance measurement, and how those are important parts of the infrastructure that are required to enable the growth. So let me just talk for a second about the trends in growth. To state the obvious, impact investing is about creating social and economic impact alongside financial return. And so, as we was talking about a moment ago, moving from big to big and to more of a many to many, much more granular involvement both on the investor side as well as on the investee side. How do we grow an industry that's really in its sort of childhood to its potential? And in a recent JP Morgan study or survey of investors, the investors said they expect that within the next 10 years that the average portfolio, retail and institutional, will comprise about 5 to 10% of its portfolio will be impact investments. And that spells out an aggregate of about $1 trillion, half a trillion to $1 trillion of invested capital within the next 10 years. That's huge. We're nowhere near that now. What does it take to get there? And some of the top impediments that investors cited were, one, a lack of track record of successful investments. Well, that's partly the fact that this is an industry that's very young. It is what it is. Two, a shortage of quality investment opportunities. I think that's partly it is what it is, but I think it's also a shortage of information and access and knowledge and comparability. And then third is inadequate impact measurement practice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but the lack of good information adds to the transaction cost, the due diligence cost, and therefore a barrier to attracting more capital, especially more mainstream capital. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about those enablers, and I'll now want to give some examples that I'm aware of in innovative finance. And as you can tell by my history, I'm sort of coming back, my career sort of bringing back a circle my interest in work previously, and really being able to now go back to that field with some more analytical tools. But I haven't been spending the last 10 years of my career working in microfinance, so have been more of an observer. And so these are things that I see as from the vantage point of an observer. So there are innovations, of course, on the investor side and on the investee side. So let me talk for a moment about some interesting things that I find interesting on the investee side, the recipient side. A couple of them in affordable housing. So one example is the Equality and Opportunity Foundation and their affordable housing program. Essentially what they're doing is bundling the microfinance financing with affordable prefabricated modular housing. And housing that comes in at a very low price point, $500 to $2,500. So part of the innovation is the bundling, and then part of it also is the type of housing, the fact that this is prefabricated, it is modular, and that the loans themselves are not, they're MFI loans. These are short-term, couple-of-year loans, and they're cash flow based, they're not collateral based. And part of the reason they're able to do that is because the due diligence, the transaction costs are low because the housing product is bundled with the financing and it's known and it reduces the due diligence costs. So I thought that was interesting from sort of a bundling perspective and a technology perspective. Another example that I wanted to mention, a friend of mine works at Deutsche Bank raising capital for their impact funds, and Deutsche Bank is doing a prototype in a housing product in Haiti, a little different model. Where they're developing duplex houses. The living quarters is upstairs, and the downstairs is it's an asset, if you will, for creating livelihood or income. So the owner could rent it out for rental income to help with the mortgage. They could use the space as a space for creating some kind of an enterprise. And Deutsche Bank is also creating an emerging mortgage market around this. So this is collateral based, it is mortgage based. But it's creating, part of what's interesting to me is, again, they're blending the financing and the asset, they're creating home as well as income producing, and they're also helping create the ecosystem through partnerships for title, for infrastructure and so forth. So I thought that was kind of an interesting model. A third example that I wanted to point out, which is really Alex's example, and that's the Grameen Foundation partnering with Qualcomm around the wireless reach initiative. And I thought that was very interesting as well. Again, from the bundling point of view and the banking point of view, I thought that was really interesting. So the idea there is to create a cellular product where the entrepreneur can sell prepaid airtime. That gives them some learning skills. So it gives them certainly some financing. It's largely, the entrepreneurs in the program are women, and several 100,000 women in the program have now been able to begin to create savings. So I thought that was interesting, the bundling and starting to create something that's sustainable. On the investor side, I wanted to give a couple of examples. One, a friend of mine at Deloitte is involved, connected with Zanbato, which may be something that you're familiar with at Stanford, I'm not sure, but it's a new Silicon Valley company, and the founder is a Stanford professor, Ryan Orr. And this is fairly new, but the idea there is bringing the many to the big. In other words, it's creating a mechanism, a technology platform for investors, small and institutional, to be able to participate in infrastructure projects. And so what they've done, for instance, they've partnered with African Development Bank and created what's called Sakoni, which is Swahili for marketplace. And it's a platform where there's much more information and drill down capability on a whole set of infrastructure projects. So investors can really use this as a resource. It's creating a marketplace, if you will. And so this provides much more transparency and efficiency in terms of the transaction process, and they just launched early this year with about 50 projects. So these are projects that are not probably big enough to get the attention of the major institutions. Some examples are the Mombasa, Nairobi, Addis Ababa corridor, phase 2, that's a $300 million project, or water sanitation program in Lake Victoria, about a $100 million project. So it's still early days, but I thought that that was a very interesting one. It's sort of creating a primary market for capital infusion, but it's also their intent to create a secondary market so that investees then have some liquidity and can trade their investments on the platform as well. So it makes it possible as an individual donor to own a piece of a bridge, for instance. So it was kind of interesting. And then also on the investor side, I wanted to bring in the notion of performance measurement, which is a lot of what I do in my day job, but I wanted to talk about some initiatives that probably most of you know about, GEARS and IRIS. So naturally, as I mentioned before, one of the ingredients for attracting more capital is more consistent, transparent measurement about what the impact is. There's a lot of segmentation of investors and what they're looking for in terms of their trade-off of financial returns, impact returns. There are a lot of different profiles. Be that as it may, being able to have a way of measuring and talking consistently about social impact in a way that's as consistent as we do financial impact is something that's sorely needed in the market. So B-Lab is a nonprofit that formed several years ago, the mission being to certify companies as B companies that would want to do business with each other. And so there's a whole set of standards and criteria about what becomes a B company in terms of social and environmental criteria. And so several hundred companies have so far been certified, and several thousand are actually using the website to sort of benchmark their performance. They then also developed GEARS. I think probably most people are familiar with it, the Global Impact Investing investment rating systems. I would like to also mention that Deloitte was a pioneer investor in GEARS. But it's designed to be one point system, like a rating system, much like a Morningstar rating or a credit rating system from Moody's or S&P or Capital IQ. And in turn, they're using some of the IRIS, I'll talk about IRIS methodology, but the idea is, and this was just launched about 6 months ago, but you go online, you go through a series of several dozen self-assessment questions. It takes maybe about an hour. You pay a fee, so if you're being rated, that's sort of the business model. You then submit documents. The documents are actually reviewed by Deloitte. It's part of the business model. And then there are sort of random visits. Maybe about 10% of each applicant will be visited each year with on-site visits, and those will begin next year. And then there's IRIS, which is more of a reporting standard. For those of you who are more familiar in the financial area, like FASB or GAAP Financial Accounting Services Board, or generally accepted accounting principles. These are the standards with all companies report their financial statements, so that there is consistency and comparability. And that's really critical for efficient working capital markets. And so IRIS is aiming to do something similar, but with the reporting of social and environmental impact. And so it's really kind of a library of methodologies, of terms, of metrics. That is something that is free on the web. And as I mentioned, those criteria are also incorporated into the GEARS rating. So the measurement systems address one of the top challenges, which is how to evolve this from a niche market to more of a mainstream market. But I would also note that as with the sustainability reporting comment I mentioned before, so true I think is with the indices. There are a number of other indices that are out there and measurement methods. It's still early days, and we don't yet have a well-established industry standard or convergence. And I think that's something, we're talking about collective action before in the industry, I think that's something on the to-do list for this industry, is to develop that collective agreement about what those standards are. So in summary, I wanted to just give a few examples of innovative financing that I know of around impact investing and market finance. The housing examples, the mobile phone example, the Zimbabwe infrastructure, the ratings and measurement methods. And some of the themes that occur to me are the bundling of the asset and the financing, the use of technology and data, and the development of more consistent metrics. I think those are some of the building blocks for more innovation and growth in this sector. Those are my comments.
Let's give all three of our speakers. So we've covered a lot of ground. I'm going to resist the temptation to ask an opening question. I want to give a chance to all of you. But we covered so much ground, from lending to education, to realizing the promise of Feed the Future, to refereeing food fights. It's been a wide kind of landscape we've etched out here. Now you all can help us fill it in and raise questions. I will say that the interesting kind of last piece, which is maybe it's the impact investing. Where's the impact? Which I think we're all facing. And how many conversations have we all had? Those of us who've been funded either by kind of donor agency bureaucrats or over-caffeinated Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs, where we get this patchwork of performance metrics that are all over the map, way too long, don't make any sense to us. And I had an insight here, listen to the last one, that maybe that situation, perhaps exaggerated, is because we have created a vacuum by not agreeing on industry standards. And then it's filled in by people who want accountability, and they should have that, but probably what they should have is more agreed upon standards that we developed based on the logic of what we're doing. And I will say that a small step in that direction, Kiva and Grameen Foundation and others in the microfinance space are working on something called the Seal of Excellence for Poverty Outreach and Transformation that we're very excited about. There's a lot of things about it on the web you can read, but it's trying to look at that, and it's based loosely on an article I wrote about 5 years ago in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So maybe the lesson is almost all the good things in the world come out of Stanford, I don't know. But in any case, that this is, again, a vacuum that is going to be filled by someone, and if we're more proactive, maybe we can be filled by us, those of us who are closer to the ground. So the floor is open for questions or comments. Please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Peter Goldstein from Intermedia. We're involved in research and evaluation, in fact, in developing countries. Mr. Shah, regarding Kiva, I'm kind of interested. I'm obviously very impressed by what you've been able to accomplish. I'm kind of interested from the lender point of view. Obviously, a lot of these countries don't really have very well-evolved financial markets, in particular credit ratings and things like that. I'm just wondering how this fits in with that issue. And, for example, somebody who borrows money from Kiva, a source, is a successful repayer or an unsuccessful repayer. How does this kind of work through the ecosystem of financing in the country in which they're operating?
Sure. Well, so many of the contexts that we work, there are, I would say, kind of very early attempts to create credit bureaus, and I think that is absolutely essential, right? So, for example, India with the national ID system, I think it's such a promising thing when it comes to, I live in this area, I move to another area, all of a sudden I have to start all over and start back at it, kind of, developing my reputation with a single financial institution. If I have that kind of portability like we have here in the US, it's really, really powerful. One of the things that we're thinking about with, I talked about this experiment in Kenya.
Yeah.
So M-Pesa is such an exciting thing. That's the mobile payments company in Kenya. And right now, 25% of the Kenyan GDP is processed through M-Pesa. More money is processed in M-Pesa than all money that's being sent through Western Union globally. So it's this really interesting service that has really brought down the transaction cost. And what we're wondering is there's a couple of credit bureaus that are beginning to form in Kenya. One is called CRB Africa. And using kind of that credit bureau, and right now it's still very nascent, and then using people's phones, can we lower the cost? Right now the cost of capital, if you're a microfinance client, is probably about a 40% APR, compared to the informal sources maybe kind of 100 to 300%. And you wonder, through the use of this kind of technology, credit bureaus, maybe people who might vouch for each other online, kind of like, what if you could vouch for people like on Yelp or on Facebook or on, on LinkedIn, if these trust networks form and then you can actually get money there and back at a fraction of the cost, that's something where there could be, what I get excited about is if you look at the Prosper and Lending Club models here in the US, there are P2P lending organizations in the US that basically are trying to disintermediate the bank itself. So the whole thesis is that if I want to borrow right now from a bank, the way they make money is they take depositor money, they on-lend it, and they keep a spread. And they have to cover the brick and mortar cost, they have to cover cost of marketing. But if I can go directly onto a website and say, I'd like to borrow money, and then investors can come in and play the unsecured credit market here in the U.S., which historically has a 94% repayment rate and it's priced and all that stuff with the FICO scores out of the 3 credit bureaus. You could actually kind of create a cost savings to a borrower as well as a really interesting asset class for the investor. The dream or the hope is that is this something that could happen on a global scale? So that's another thing that's kind of way out there in the future, but the test market for Kiva right now is Kenya.
Great. This in the back there. Yeah, Kimberly. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kimberly with Kermit Foundation, on our savings project. I actually had a follow-up on Kiva Zip. Really interested to hear about that program and that pilot. You talked a little bit about kind of the opportunity of the mobile to lower savings and going directly to the clients, but just curious to hear a little bit more about some of the challenges and risks maybe, and initially in this pilot and what you guys have learned so far.
Sure. I just want to appreciate the second cup of coffee, no recap. I took the red eye in this morning. I landed probably 2 hours ago into Dallas and had I don't know why they call it a European shower, but I did one of those and stay away from me, and I appreciate the second cup of coffee. So the Kiva Zip project has a ton of questions, a ton of risks. How do you actually prevent against over-indebtedness? How do you, one of the biggest questions is why would people repay if, one of the great values of intermediation in the market is, that institution exists, they have local loan officers, they have relationships in that community. Am I really going to pay back a bunch of strangers on their internet? But you got to go back kind of 15 years and, if you think about the experiment of eBay, would I buy a flat screen TV from a complete stranger and would they actually ship it to me? Right? So, I think there are ways that we can use kind of a lot of, there's a lot of tools that we can pull together and stitch together. I think now that if the opportunity to get access to capital on better terms is there, if you play well with the system, and then if you play well, you can vouch for another borrower. This is what we're doing now. We're starting to let borrowers vouch for other borrowers. It's going back to what Professor Eunice really invented in her first place, or really pulled together, which is the solidarity group model. We're wondering if we break these problems down into like tests and kind of throw a lot of time and attention on it, if we can go through it. But I think there are a lot of questions around, are we really going to reach the people that we intend to reach? Those people who aren't digitally included. Are those people who we're reaching, are they already over leveraged with debt? How do we know we're doing it responsibly? And then how will this system scale without widespread fraud and malfeasance? Those are some of the big questions that we have. I can tell you today that Kiva Zip model, we have 60 borrowers live in, it's only 4 months old, 60 borrowers in Kenya, paying back at a 97% repayment rate at this stage, and then 12 borrowers in the San Francisco Bay Area, really small. And what we're trying to do is actually run a number of experiments around, for example, if a church group vouches for someone, do we see a higher repayment rate than if a technical assistance provider vouches for someone? And we're going to try to figure out, is there any kind of formula to where it's predictive of responsible lending and solid repayment rates? So we'll see. We're going to learn by doing.
I want to also encourage questions for our panelists who got a full night's sleep last night. But in the back, please.
My name is Rick O'Sullivan. I'm the founder and co-chair of SID Washington Civil Society Work Group. So I must start off by taking offense to your comments saying the civil society is new to development. I quote here that I quote Tocqueville, who in 1832 said, "In the front of any social progress, in France you find the government, in the United States you find associations," referring not just to business associations, but church, civic, etc. What I, and the first, you mentioned Stanford a couple times, the first civil society organization here to address the social concern was up in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636 to address education with Harvard College. It's done pretty well, I understand. What I'm concerned about, I didn't hear any talk about, was risk mitigation. You have subsidized risk through loan guarantees, but in the end, what you have to do is bring the risk down. And if I may, just a quick example how we did this in Kosovo with agriculture, with farmers. The risk was the Serbs took the cadastre with them when they left, so no one knew who and what. They couldn't take loans against land. No one wanted to take out collateral because no bank wants to own a cow. And so what we did, we created an association that came up with quality control standards on the product and best practices standards on the farms and credentialed farms. They could produce the product and at a guaranteed quality, and they had business practices that meant they would do it consistently over time, reducing the cost or the risk to the buyers of dairy products. We then sold this credential to the banks. I mean, sold, we marketed, saying farmers who meet these credentials are a good risk, or who meet these standards are a good risk for you. We're going to set up lending not against the farm, but against the contract, and put the bank in front of the farmer when the payments went out. But what it really did was by vetting and reducing the risk to the lender, we dropped interest rates from, well, assuming a farmer could get an interest rate, interest rates went from 21% to 14%, and we got them to waive the loan origination fees and dramatically increased farmers' access to capital by setting up a series of credentials. You mentioned the seal of excellence for finance firms, but what we did was we focused on reducing the risk to the lender. And that's one way civil society has been doing this for a couple of centuries. So I'd like to look about risk mitigation.
Maybe we can just go down the panel, because it's a very meaty question. Let me just say at the outset that my recollections of 1636 are a little fuzzy. But just to clarify, I may still be offending our chairman, but I think what's new is that civil society, let me put it this way, what's old is civil society solving localized problems, and what's old is civil society, when they're really good at that, creating pilots or models that can be taken up by other parts of society. What's new, not fairly new, is civil society aspiring to take those models and themselves apply it on a national or global scale, rather than, again, the handoff to business or government. And so again, that's probably open to challenge, but I just want to clarify the point there, and then the financial implications of taking that larger job on.
So on the risk mitigation, I'll address that in a couple ways. One, what you just described was a tripartite agreement, basically. So, and that is something that we try to do in most cases when we go out. For example, when I was with IFC for many years, I ran several programs where the last one being an agri-finance program, where we would go out and lend money to a financial institution in Zambia or Nigeria or Liberia, whatever. But we would combine that with technical support at the financial institution itself, but also at the farm level. So trying to build those mitigants across that value chain, and then also bringing the private sector in with that tripartite agreement and having that contract in hand. So that does mitigate the risk to a certain extent. And then if you can lend money, then throw a guarantee on the side of that, then you're really starting to have some development impact. The other thing I would say is with regards to products that the banks are offering, products such as purchase order finance, where you're lending again on contract. These are safe products, and you're basically, the bank is getting paid up front before that client is, once they've shipped and once, before they get their money from the company that they're shipping to, the bank is paid. So you have to introduce those types of products to the financial markets that you're dealing with, and as sophisticated as a market South Africa is, they didn't have purchase order finance until most recently, and we've introduced purchase order finance, for example, at ABSA and Standard Bank, which are two of the large banks in South Africa, and they've actually started to utilize that, and it's been very, very encouraging to see how much lending they could do on the back of a product like purchase order finance, which you would think would be a no-brainer, but it wasn't for these major banks. So just to conclude my answer there, I think the tripartite agreements, the technical support is key at both the bank level and at the farm level, and then bringing in the private sector to engage. Then I think you can at least reduce the risk to a level that the banks are comfortable lending in.
Charles?
I think it's a great story. I actually had a follow-up question. I was curious in that work that you did. It was a great story, but that work that you did in terms of trying to mitigate the risks of the underlying operations, how were those services paid?
Well, the reason the investment was not taken, why they weren't taking quality products in the first place, was the level of corruption in most of our health industry. People weren't investing in making quality note because whether you got certified, depending on whether you paid the bribe, not whether you made the appropriate investment. By what this did, this arrangement, is it monetized the value to the farmer for taking on the risk and making the investment over and above the bribe. Also, what we did, the standard that we set was higher than the COSAVAR standard. So we basically threw the gauntlet down at the health industry. We've had independent people already certify these things. We defy you to say they don't meet your standards. But the services that educated the farmers was delivered through the COSAVAR Association of Dairy Farmers, milk producers. And those initially subsidized through USAID grants, but the system was designed that these education programs would become self-sustaining. People would be willing to pay for them because once you got the certification, you could, one, you're more competitive in getting milk contracts at higher prices because there's less wastage, and your cost of taking a loan would cut by a third. So the initial issue was, well, why should I pay for this training? Why don't you give it to me? So that there was the free rider thing that we had to get past. And by monetizing the value of the credential, the seal, it made people willing to pay for it. So basically, we connected the market signals that weren't working.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you for that, because I mean, part of what I was thinking about in your question about risk mitigation, and given that I'm a measurement person, I think about risk measurement as well. But part of where I was going with your question was thinking about systematically, how do you create the environment where those kind of risk mitigation services and risk measurement, like an example that you were giving in terms of the credit bureau and the phone, I think that those are kind of grassroots originated. And that's part of what is interesting to me. Where does the impetus come to create that?
That's an excellent point, because this doesn't work unless the credentialing institution is sustainable. If it's going to collapse and go away, then no one's going to get it. It won't hold on. So what's really critical in any of these programs is to develop the business model of the agency you're working with, and that it becomes self-sustaining when the donor money disappears.
Yeah, I think that's critical, and I think it gets back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about where are we going to come up with standards, and is that going to be a bottom-up, self-regulated versus something top-down imposed? And it sounds like what's needed is some appropriate integration of the two. I mean, when I'm not at a rating agency, and I'm not representing any rating agency, but I do know that Standard & Poor's spent a bunch of time investing to develop a microfinance rating methodology. And they did a lot of work, and it's sitting on a shelf. And I think part of that is just what goes on in organizations. A champion was lost or moved, there was a shift, it wasn't a high-profile, profitable project. So the environment changed, the champion went away, and it's gathering dust. I understand Moody's is more active in creating a Center for Social Impact Investing. So part of it is how do you create those standards, but also how do you do it in a way where you have that kind of bottom-up innovation and really customize the model so it works.
I would recommend a good study to look at is the Better Business Bureau's certified charity certification. Following 9/11, all sorts of faux agencies showed up asking people for money to help the 9/11 survivors. And so there was so much fraud was going on, like $60 million in the first year, that the Better Business Bureau stepped in and created a charity assessment tool for nonprofit.
I believe it's called the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance.
That's it.
And I think that is a useful tool. Promo, anything you want to add on this? Or go to the next question? Still awake?
Well, I'm still waiting. I think just 2 points on this. One thing is, for example, we're looking this year at expanding to SME finance. And we realize that what's great about the AID default guarantee is that you motivate local banks to actually do that, and then you kind of cover half their loss, and it's the way to really kind of do it. And one of our big questions is if you see a $50,000 loan for a factory in Liberia, a capital need, will the internet community in $25 increments want to actually fund it? And so what we want to do is get local banks to basically kind of match the internet community one-for-one, getting leverage on the money. And we're hoping that kind of together, we can learn by doing. But the second thing is, I think by putting defaults and failure up on the internet, what we're finding is that it somewhat prevents, I think, all that sunlight, a lot of the malfeasance that otherwise would have happened. We've seen it a lot on Kiva. We've signed up 185 field partners, and we've closed down about 30 of them. Because, and a huge percentage of the time, why we had to close it down is because we felt that there was kind of intentional fraud and malfeasance at the very senior management level. And so, I mean, it is not a...
When you say shut down, you mean stop lending?
Stop lending. But then here's the thing, it doesn't disappear. If you type in their name into Google, that organization, basically their page comes up, a full explanation, they have a chance to respond. And there's some organizations that are getting new management, and we'll let them update that, and they can attract investors again. But what we'd like to do is create a very public record, kind of like the Wise Giving Alliance, so that future people aren't fooled, and that you can actually reward people who have good internal controls and so on and so forth. So I think hopefully by making this more public and shedding more light on it in a way that is searchable by all other people who come along, hopefully we can that can help control risk as well.
I have a question for Terry. My name is Mona Davies, and I'm with Africare, and I manage projects that we have in Ghana in the Volta region. And this is an AGRA-funded project, and AGRA has partnered with a local bank there, Standard Bank, to provide the microfinancing for the farmers. But again, they're very risk averse, and they're not really stepping up. In the meantime, the planting season is on us, so we've been asked to look for other sources of financing while they sort this out with Standard Bank. And the other banks we're approaching again, the farmers are very grassroots, and they don't have any purchase orders. And they've been grouped together into organizations. Some of the farmers in the organizations have a track record of non-repayment with some of the local banks. So we kind of stuck now where we had to deliver results pretty soon. We had to plan but we need money for inputs.
Right.
And so I was wondering, this USAID model, is this, I mean, USAID is active in Ghana, and is there an opportunity here to approach them to partner with us? Because at the end of the day, AGRA is backing this project, and they will sort this out with Standard Bank.
Well, it sounds like, what's the issue with Standard Bank?
But we really don't know, and AGRA is not very forthcoming as to where the gridlock is. We've just simply been told to just be very creative in our approach and just come up with solutions and just deliver. And
Are there any buyers on the product, on the commodity?
That's what I mean by we don't have purchase orders to take to the bank to say, this has been guaranteed.
What is the commodity?
Right now, I think the first tranche will be maize.
No, maize, okay.
Maize.
So have you approached EcoBank or?
Not where, first of all, the banks in Accra won't work with the rural farmers. And that's what we're finding in local regions, so we have to resort to the local banks there. And we keep running to one issue or another. We worked with we approached Opportunity International. And for a while there, that was going well until they decided that the cost of monitoring this program way out of the region was going to drive up the interest rates, and it just wouldn't be profitable, so they backed out.
Yeah. No, I wish I had a ready-made solution for you. I don't. What I could suggest is to try EcoBank because, for example, their head of agriculture, their agricultural department for Sub-Saharan Africa is based in Accra. So, I can put you in touch with a gentleman there who's responsible for agriculture across the continent. So, that's one area where I can potentially help.
But I was kind of hoping that there would be a window of opportunity here with USAID.
Well, USAID has already signed the guarantee with EcoBank in Ghana.
Gotcha.
So that's already done. It's there. So I think if you approach EcoBank and go directly to their agricultural department, and if you have some technical support, which it sounds like you do, I think the other key element that's missing is the buyers. So if you can find buyers for the maize, then the banks are going to be a bit more amicable to lending.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. I guess part of the culture of SID is people are comfortable asking follow-up questions after they ask an initial question. So, but that has put us at the end where I think we have time for one more question, and I'll give it to you, sir.
My name is Bill Jorn. I won't stand up because I'll be in everybody's way. We have a new startup called ROI3, which will be a platform for various kinds of products and services, informational, educational, access to things and so forth. And so using cell phones in the developing countries. So my question to all of you, or to whoever wants to answer, is with the tremendous growth of cell phones, I'm familiar with them, how are you using the cell phones to get word out to people, and then what is the form of communication back and forth? Is that a clear enough question?
Yeah. Why don't we just go down the row and answering that, or any final comments, and then we'll close.
Well, Alex, I think you guys are a real leader in kind of information over the phone, health workers and kind of access. I mean, it's very modest, but what you guys just launched with Starbucks and Incofiend, the Fair Trade, the Ag Finance Fund, and what you guys are doing around marketing information and stuff. And I think what Green App Labs is doing is something that should be studied. I talked about the Kiva Zip model and how we're trying to build off the M-Pesa payment rails to lend directly onto people's mobile phones in a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time. That's if I think the big question, there's this great quote by William Gibson. He says, "The future is here, it just hasn't been evenly distributed yet." And people talk about Silicon Valley and how there's a lot of innovation coming out of there, but I really think we need to look at what's happening in Kenya why hasn't mobile payment spread beyond Kenya? And I think that's another thing that Grameen Foundation is working on with MTN and others in Uganda. So if those rails can exist around payments, I mean, it doesn't even exist here in the US. We still walk out with our wallet with cash. But if we can get that going in the next 10 years, it's a huge platform for innovation, and that's the one we're really focused on at Kiva.
Well, I don't have direct experience being at Deloitte in building out a model around that. I think it's a great question, and what it brings to my mind is, I think what we're looking at in terms of how to grapple with emerging technology like this in emerging markets for social purposes. It's the very same thing that's going on in industry, and again, that's something that's very early days. The potential of what you can do with technology today and data, and I think and the analytics that you can put around that is just starting to burgeon. And there are very, very few companies in the private sector who have really nailed this or mastered it or would be regarded as early leaders. So I think that I would conjecture that as you look at questions like that, you look at analogies that are going on with companies. And I take Amtrak all the time, and I know that in June, Amtrak is converting to electronic tickets, and all their conductors are now complaining about, I got an iPhone, how is that going to work? Everybody's wondering how that's going to work. So I think that's going on everywhere, not only in emerging markets.
Well, you can be sure I'll be in touch with all of you.
No, I would just say that I agree completely with Pramal that we need to see more expansion beyond Kenya, and we're starting to see that. I mean, there are some programs out in Pakistan, for example, that are really growing in mobile banking. South Africa uses mobile banking, not as much as they should, but they do. And it's more to the city dwellers, if you will. Where mobile banking can really be useful is going out into the rural communities where there aren't bricks and mortar, and so that's what we need to do, is start to take advantage of that. The experiences in regards to farmers, for example, there are in Zambia, a project that I ran in Zambia where, it's more informational at this stage, but, getting commodity prices, getting weather reports, getting things about crop insurance, these types of things, getting information out to the rural communities, to the farmers, that is useful to them on a daily basis is where we need to be. But we also need to be able to do transactional banking on mobile communication devices, because I think that's the future, at least if we want to have that rural development impact that we're all looking for.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to make a couple closing comments. A session like this, listen, you come to it, you find out what's happening with Amtrak. It's what you learn in these sessions. Premal did a very nice job talking about what Grameen Foundation is doing in the mobile space, and it's hard to improve upon it, but I'll try in a minute or two. We feel that, first of all, the proliferation of mobile phones, 5 billion or 6 billion and counting, was not really inevitable. It actually happened because of some risks taken and some hypotheses tested 10, 12 years ago. And one of the things there actually has its origins in microfinance. In Bangladesh, when I moved from there in '97 to start Grameen Foundation, there was a mobile phone monopoly. Service was bad and the cost was very high. So really no one had it. Today a rickshaw pullers in Dhaka have it. Back then you could even be an expat in an international organization and you just wouldn't even invest that much to do it, learning an international salary package. They opened it up, and Telenor wanted to go in and partner with an affiliated company of Grameen Bank called Grameen Telecom. And as Telenor thought about its business strategy, initially it was about, well, this is kind of like quasi-CSR play for Bangladesh. We're never really going to make much money here, and we should probably limit it just to the cities, the 4 major cities. And Grameen really pushed their thinking, and they were open to it, to experiment having coverage outside of the major cities and putting up some Grameen borrowers as payphone, to have a payphone business. And next thing you know, the 10-year projections of use of mobile phones were exceeded in like 18 months. And that was probably one of the early stories of where this momentum gathered, and there was at the lower end of society, an ability to pay for and to design products and devices and payment plans that they could buy into, and everything exploded. And we think this is really one of the potential game changers in international development. It can be easily overhyped and overly simplistic thinking about how to leverage the mobile phone, but there's still huge potential. And just to tick off, as Permal said, we're working with a mobile agriculture play in Uganda called the Community Knowledge Worker Program that we're tremendously excited about. Agricultural extension through peers using a database you can access through a very simple phone. We're doing a mobile health play in Ghana and now in India that is kind of a mobile midwife / kind of a mobile kind of reminders and support for people with HIV and AIDS. We've just launched a mobile money incubator in Uganda with a partnership of Barclays, Gates Foundation, and CGAP. And in Indonesia, as was mentioned at the earlier, we set up a kind of a business there that is owned and run by Indonesians. We're an investor and a partner that began with Top Up, where an entrepreneur could literally sell 10 cents worth of airtime to their neighbor, which is often the increments that they want, earn a small commission, and it really starts to add up. And now we're building on that, the App Lab Indonesia model with our partner Ruma, building in a model where they can actually do a job search, a kind of a monster.com on the phone, but for day labor and people looking for jobs in their communities. And so which one of these is the real, are we going to incubate and spin off? Which one of these has the biggest potential? But we're experimenting in a number of different geographies and sectors about where the mobile phone, and we're not the only ones for sure. With that, I just want to thank you all for coming, and also want to thank the panelists one more time.